The green feathers caught the morning light streaming through the kitchen window of the suburban Milwaukee home, each one trembling as Jasper stretched his wings with the deliberate grace of a creature who understood his place in the world's careful rhythm. Margaret Chen had always marveled at how her African gray parrot seemed to anticipate the day's unfolding, chirping softly when the automatic coffee maker began its morning ritual at precisely 6:15, mimicking the telephone's distinctive ring 3 seconds before the actual sound filled the kitchen, and repeating her late husband's favorite phrase, "Another beautiful day, Maggie," in Robert's exact cadence, complete with the slight wheeze from 40 years of Marlboro Lights and the gentle Irish lilt that had never quite faded despite 5 decades in America. That October morning in 2009, Margaret noticed something fundamentally different in Jasper's behavior, a shift so subtle yet profound that it made her pause with her coffee mug halfway to her lips. The bird, usually vocal and demanding attention from the moment she entered the kitchen, perched silently on his favorite wooden stand, the one Robert had carved by hand during their first year of marriage, back when his fingers were steady and his eyes could still focus on intricate detail work. Jasper's dark, intelligent eyes followed every movement with an intensity that made Margaret feel as if she were being studied, evaluated, perhaps even judged by a creature whose understanding of human nature exceeded her own. If you've ever lived with someone, human or otherwise, whose sudden silence felt louder than any words they might speak, you'll understand the weight that settled in Margaret's chest as she watched Jasper's unusual stillness. "What's wrong, boy?" Margaret asked, approaching the cage with the gentle voice she'd perfected over their 12 years together, a tone that combined the maternal instincts she'd never had opportunity to use with children, and the patient affection she'd learned during Robert's final months. Jasper tilted his head in that peculiar way that had always reminded her of Robert's manner of listening, complete attention focused on the speaker, as if their words contained the most important information in the world, and spoke in a voice that wasn't quite his usual confident mimicry. "Please don't hurt me anymore." The words froze Margaret's hand halfway to the cage door, her fingers suddenly nerveless as if the simple phrase had somehow severed the connection between her brain and her body. She'd never taught Jasper those words. Robert certainly never said them. Their 47-year marriage had been built on gentle disagreements about thermostat settings and good-natured arguments over whether the Chicago Cubs would ever win another World Series, not the kind of desperate pleading that suggested fear or violence. In their quiet suburban life, surrounded by book clubs that discussed Nicholas Sparks novels and neighborhood barbecues, where the most dramatic event was Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses causing jealousy among the garden club members, such phrases had no place, no context, no reason for existence. Yet here was Jasper, repeating them with a clarity and emotional undertone that suggested not random television absorption, but recent learning, recent fear, recent repetition born from necessity rather than casual observation. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities with the desperate efficiency of someone confronting a puzzle whose solution might determine everything that followed. Had he picked up the phrase from television during one of the afternoon soap operas she sometimes left playing for company? From a visitor whose personal life contained dramas she'd never suspected? The postman, Jerry, sometimes chatted with Jasper through the screen door during his daily rounds, but his conversations centered on weather predictions and weekend fishing plans, delivered in the cheerful tone of someone whose biggest concern was whether rain might delay his golf game. The cleaning lady, Rosa, spoke mostly Spanish to the bird, teaching him buenos dias and qué bonito, with the patient enthusiasm of someone delighted to share her native language with an eager student. Jasper delivered these phrases with Rosa's exact Puerto Rican accent, complete with the rolling R, sounds that had taken Margaret years to approximate even poorly. But Rosa's vocabulary focused on encouragement and affection, praising Jasper's beautiful feathers and bright intelligence, not the desperate words of someone begging for mercy. Throughout that day, Margaret found herself studying Jasper with the same worried attention she'd given Robert during his final months, searching for signs, for explanations that might make sense of an inexplicable change. The bird remained unusually quiet, speaking only when directly addressed, and even then, his responses lacked their usual playful tone. Instead of his typical enthusiastic, "Hello, beautiful." When she entered the room, he offered only a subdued "good morning" in her own voice, as if he were merely going through the motions of conversation rather than engaging in their usual spirited exchanges. Margaret tried to convince herself it was her imagination, perhaps grief playing tricks after 2 years of widowhood, when every unexpected sound or unfamiliar behavior carried the weight of potential loss. She'd grown hypersensitive to change since Robert's death, interpreting normal variations in routine as possible harbingers of further upheaval. Maybe Jasper was simply having an off day, the avian equivalent of waking up on the wrong side of the bed, and tomorrow would restore their comfortable patterns of interaction. But as evening approached and she covered Jasper's cage with the familiar blue cloth, a nightly ritual that had remained unchanged for over a decade, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in their quiet world. The phrase continued to echo in her mind, "Please don't hurt me anymore." 7 words that seemed to carry the weight of experiences she couldn't begin to imagine, spoken by a creature who had never known anything but gentle care and predictable routine. She whispered their usual goodnight blessing, "Sleep tight, sweet boy," and tried to dismiss the growing certainty that this might be the last time she would perform this simple act of love. The house settled into its familiar nighttime sounds, the refrigerator's gentle hum, the heating system's occasional whisper, the distant traffic on Greenfield Avenue. But Margaret lay awake long past her usual bedtime, staring at the ceiling and wondering what invisible forces might be gathering to disrupt the careful peace she'd constructed around her solitary life. She never saw Jasper again. Margaret woke to silence, not the comfortable quiet of early morning before the world stirred to life, but the hollow, echoing absence of sound that immediately signals something fundamentally wrong with the natural order of things. No cheerful, "Good morning, Maggie," delivered in Robert's distinctive voice with its hint of morning raspiness. No gentle rustling of feathers as Jasper shifted on his perch, stretching wings and settling into the day's first position of comfort. No rhythmic tapping of claws on wood as he performed his morning grooming ritual, each movement as predictable and reassuring as sunrise itself. The blue cloth lay crumpled on the kitchen floor beside Jasper's open cage, the small door hanging wide like a mouth frozen in perpetual surprise. Margaret stared at the scene with the disoriented confusion of someone who'd awakened to find the fundamental laws of physics had been quietly repealed during the night. The October wind rattled the kitchen window. She was absolutely certain she'd latched before retiring, double-checking the mechanism as she'd done every night since Robert's death. When living alone had made her hyper-aware of home security in ways that 47 years of marriage had never required. Now the window stood open just enough for a determined bird to squeeze through, though Margaret couldn't fathom why Jasper would attempt such an escape. In 12 years of shared life, he'd shown no interest in the outdoors beyond what he could observe from the safety of his perch. His world was contained within these walls. Morning sunbaths by the kitchen window, evening conversations with Margaret while she prepared simple dinners for one, occasional supervised flights around the living room when she felt he needed exercise. The concept of voluntary departure seemed as foreign to his nature as the idea of a fish abandoning water for the uncertain promises of dry land. She searched every room with increasing desperation, calling his name with a voice that grew more strained with each repetition. "Jasper! Jasper! Where are you, sweet boy?" The house felt larger somehow, emptier, as if Jasper's absence had changed its very dimensions, revealing spaces that had somehow remained hidden during his presence. She checked behind the ancient Zenith television that Robert had refused to replace despite its increasingly temperamental reception, inside closets that smelled of mothballs and forgotten seasons, under beds where dust bunnies gathered, like small gray conspiracies. She examined the window screen with the methodical attention of a crime scene investigator, running her fingers along every inch of mesh for tears, forced openings, any sign of how a bird might have achieved the impossible feat of opening a latched window and removing himself from the only home he'd ever known. The screen remained intact, pristine, without even the small tears that accumulated naturally over years of weather and wear. The mystery deepened her panic, transforming simple concern into something approaching genuine terror. By noon, Margaret had contacted every neighbor within a 3-block radius, her voice growing hoarse from repeated explanations of her missing parrot. Mrs. Henderson, despite her 86 years and increasing reliance on a walker, promised to check her garden shed and the elaborate rose garden that had been her pride for over 4 decades. The Kowalski family organized their 3 teenage sons into a search party that combed the nearby Oak Creek Park with the enthusiasm of young people who still believed that effort alone could solve any problem. They called Jasper's name until their voices echoed off the empty playground equipment, startling the few remaining migrating birds who hadn't yet begun their southern journey. Jerry, the postman who'd known Jasper almost as long as Margaret had owned him, altered his entire route to keep watch for a gray bird with unusual vocabulary. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Chin," he assured her with the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years observing neighborhood rhythms and understanding that most mysteries eventually revealed themselves to patient observation. "Parrots are smart. If he's out there, he'll figure out how to get back home. Animals have instincts we don't even understand." But the animal control officer who arrived that afternoon carried a different message, delivered with the gentle honesty of someone who'd participated in too many similar searches. "Ma'am, I have to be straight with you. Parrots don't usually survive Wisconsin winters, especially birds that have never experienced outdoor conditions. If he's out there, we need to find him soon, before the real cold sets in. Tonight's supposed to drop into the 30s, and that's already pushing the limits of what a domesticated bird can handle." The woman's words carried the weight of experience with similar searches, most ending in quiet disappointment rather than joyful reunions. Margaret could see in her expression the carefully controlled sympathy of someone who'd learned to manage expectations while maintaining hope, a delicate balance that required acknowledging harsh realities, without crushing the spirit of those who refused to accept loss, without exhausting every possibility. Margaret spent the remainder of that day creating and posting flyers on every telephone pole and community board within a 5-mile radius. "Lost. African gray parrot. Answers to Jasper. May repeat phrases in deceased husband's voice. Significant reward offered. Please call day or night." The description felt inadequate, failing to capture Jasper's personality, his uncanny ability to sense her moods and respond with exactly the right phrase from Robert's extensive vocabulary, the way he'd softly murmur her late husband's pet names for her during her loneliest moments when the house felt too large and too quiet for one person to fill. Days blurred into weeks with the relentless momentum of time that refuses to pause for personal tragedy. Autumn stripped the trees bare with ruthless efficiency, and Margaret's hope followed suit, diminishing with each cold morning that brought no sign of her missing companion. She left Jasper's cage uncovered and positioned by the kitchen window like a lighthouse beacon, hoping he might see it from wherever his journey had taken him, and remember the warmth and safety of the life they'd shared. She recorded her voice calling his name, playing the messages on repeat in the backyard, until neighbors gently suggested she might be disturbing their sleep. The recording sounded increasingly desperate, even to her own ears, the voice of someone whose rational mind understood the futility of the effort, but whose heart refused to accept defeat without exhausting every conceivable strategy. The first snow fell on November 15th, dusting the ground with winter's quiet finality. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching flakes settle on the empty wooden perch outside, the one Robert had installed hoping to attract cardinals and blue jays to brighten their morning coffee ritual. Now it served as a memorial to absence, each snowflake. A small reminder that somewhere in the growing cold, if he was still alive, her companion was facing challenges no domesticated creature should ever encounter. She placed a small electric heater near the open window and left it running day and night, creating a warm pocket of air that might guide a lost bird home. The gesture was probably futile, certainly expensive, but it represented action in the face of helplessness, hope maintained, despite mounting evidence that hope itself had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Detective Sarah Morrison had seen enough missing pet cases during her 15 years with the Milwaukee Police Department to recognize the signs of someone whose grief extended far beyond the simple loss of an animal companion. Margaret Chen sat across from her desk in the precinct's interview room, hands folded precisely in her lap with the controlled composure of someone barely holding themselves together, answering questions with the measured responses of someone who understood that every word might determine whether her case received serious attention or was quietly filed away with hundreds of similar reports that rarely led to satisfactory conclusions. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Margaret's face, emphasizing the lines that seemed to have deepened since Jasper's disappearance 3 weeks earlier. Morrison had learned to read the subtle indicators of genuine distress versus the dramatic presentations of people seeking attention or compensation, and everything about Margaret's demeanor suggested someone experiencing authentic loss rather than performing grief for sympathetic witnesses. "You mentioned Jasper said something unusual the morning he disappeared," Detective Morrison said, reviewing her notes with the careful attention she applied to all cases, regardless of whether they involved missing persons or missing pets. "Can you tell me again exactly what he said, and describe the context in which he said it?" Margaret's voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her black leather purse. The same purse she'd carried to Robert's funeral, Morrison noticed, recognizing the particular way widows often clung to familiar objects during periods of additional stress. "Please don't hurt me anymore. But, Detective, I need you to understand. Jasper never learned those words from me or my husband. We lived quietly, peacefully. Robert passed 2 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and yes, there were difficult moments during his illness, but nothing involving violence or the kind of fear those words suggest. We didn't argue. We didn't fight. We certainly never spoke to each other or anyone else in ways that would teach a bird to say such things." Morrison had heard similar stories before, though usually involving dogs with suspicious injuries or cats found in unusual circumstances that suggested domestic situations their owners preferred not to discuss. Pets often revealed family secrets their owners thought they'd successfully hidden, serving as unwitting witnesses to behaviors that contradicted carefully maintained public facades. But Margaret Chen didn't fit the profile of someone harboring dark secrets or living a double life. Her home, which Morrison had visited during the initial missing pet report, reflected the careful maintenance of someone who took pride in creating beauty and order, not the controlled chaos that often characterized households where violence simmered beneath polite surfaces. The detective's visit to Margaret's house had revealed a space that told the story of a long, apparently happy marriage gradually transitioning into dignified widowhood. Photographs chronicled decades of shared vacations, anniversary celebrations, and quiet moments captured with the unself-conscious ease of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Robert's presence remained everywhere. His favorite reading chair positioned perfectly to catch afternoon light, his coffee mug still occupying its designated spot in the dish drainer, his reading glasses resting on the kitchen counter as if he might return at any moment to finish the crossword puzzle that remained perpetually half completed. Is it possible Jasper heard those words from television, or perhaps from previous owners before you acquired him? Morrison asked, though even as she spoke, she doubted her own suggestion. African Greys were notorious for their selective learning, typically mimicking sounds and phrases that carried emotional weight or frequent repetition rather than random background noise. A bird wouldn't casually pick up such specific language without significant exposure to the emotions and situations that gave those words meaning. Margaret shook her head with the certainty of someone who'd already considered and rejected that possibility. "Detective, I got Jasper as a young bird from a reputable breeder in Brookfield. The woman kept detailed records of all her birds, their health histories, their placement with new families. Jasper lived with Robert and me his entire life, from the time he was 4 months old until he disappeared at 12 years. His vocabulary came from our daily routines. Robert's morning greetings, my telephone conversations with my sister in Phoenix, the evening news programs we watched together. Nothing traumatic, nothing frightening, nothing that would explain those particular words." Morrison made additional notes, though she suspected this case would join the growing file of mysteries that defied easy explanation or resolution. Missing pet cases rarely received extensive police resources, particularly when no evidence suggested criminal activity or deliberate harm. Yet something about Margaret's story nagged at her professional instincts, the way certain details didn't align into a comfortable narrative that could be easily categorized and filed away. The detective had learned to trust her intuition about when cases contained hidden elements that initial investigation might not reveal. Sometimes, the most important information emerged not from what people said, but from what they didn't say. The small inconsistencies or unexpected details that suggested larger stories waiting to be uncovered. Margaret's case felt like it contained such elements, though Morrison couldn't yet identify what specific aspects troubled her, or why a missing parrot case seemed to deserve more attention than standard protocols typically provided. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, did you have any recent visitors to your home? Any repair work done? Service calls? Anyone who might have spent time around Jasper in the weeks before he disappeared?" Morrison asked, following the investigative protocols that had served her well during her career. Sometimes missing animals were taken by people who had observed them during routine interactions, deciding that a valuable pet might be worth the risk of theft, particularly if they believed the owner was elderly, isolated, or unlikely to pursue aggressive investigation. The question hung in the air while Margaret considered, her expression suggesting she was mentally reviewing recent months for any unusual interactions or circumstances that might provide explanations for Jasper's mysterious final words and subsequent disappearance. "Rosa, my cleaning lady, comes every 2 weeks. She's been with me for 3 years, speaks mostly Spanish to Jasper, teaches him phrases like "que bonito" and "buenos dias." She loves that bird, brings him special treats, always asks about his health and behavior. Jerry, the postman, sometimes chats with him through the screen door during his daily rounds, but those conversations focus on weather and his weekend fishing plans. She paused, searching her memory for additional possibilities. The cable repairman came in September to fix problems with my television reception. He worked primarily in the living room, spent maybe 2 hours in the house, barely noticed Jasper except to comment that he'd never seen such a talkative bird. Nice young man, very professional, cleaned up after himself before leaving. Each name went into Morrison's notes, though she doubted any would yield significant leads. The cable repair angle intrigued her slightly. Utility workers entered homes regularly, had access to private spaces, observed family dynamics that most people never saw. They also occasionally encountered domestic situations that remained hidden from neighbors, friends, and even extended family members. A service worker might witness interactions that would teach a parrot disturbing phrases, particularly if those interactions involved raised voices, threats, or pleas for mercy. I'll follow up on these leads. Morrison promised, though both women understood the limitations of what police resources could realistically accomplish for a missing pet case. In the meantime, keep checking with local animal shelters, veterinary clinics, and pet stores. Sometimes birds turn up weeks or months later, and having your information on file with these organizations increases the chances of being contacted if someone finds him. Margaret gathered her purse and stood with the dignity of someone accustomed to handling disappointment alone, her movements careful and deliberate in the way of people who'd learned that emotional control required constant vigilance. Detective Morrison, I know this probably seems like just a lost pet case to you, and I understand that you have more serious crimes demanding your attention. But I need you to know that Jasper was my connection to Robert, to the life we built together over 47 years. When he disappeared, he took something irreplaceable with him. Not just his presence, but the sound of my husband's voice, the daily reminders of our shared history, the sense that some parts of our love story would continue even after death separated us. After Margaret left, Morrison stared at the case file, unable to shake the feeling that this story contained elements she couldn't yet see clearly. She made notes to run background checks on the names Margaret had provided, though she suspected the answers, if they existed at all, lay buried deeper than standard police procedures typically reached. Something about the case felt unfinished, as if the real story was waiting to emerge from circumstances that hadn't yet aligned properly to reveal their hidden connections. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, transforming the acute pain of fresh loss into a duller, more manageable ache that settles into the background rhythm of daily life, like a persistent minor chord in an otherwise familiar melody. Margaret Chen learned to wake without unconsciously listening for Jasper's morning greeting, to eat dinner without automatically setting aside small portions of vegetables he might enjoy, to watch television without wondering which phrases he might choose to absorb and repeat in his uncannily accurate mimicry of human voices and emotions. The years accumulated like dust in corners, barely noticeable day by day, but undeniably present when examined closely during the kind of thorough cleaning that revealed how much time had actually passed. Margaret turned 72, then 75, her movement slower, but her routine essentially unchanged, except for the subtle accommodations that aging required: a magnifying glass for reading prescription bottles, a grabber tool for reaching high shelves, a medical alert bracelet that her sister Diane had insisted upon after Margaret's minor fall in the bathroom during the winter of 2016. The house seemed larger now, filled with the kind of profound quiet that settles into spaces once occupied by beloved voices. Margaret had grown accustomed to the silence, even found comfort in its predictability, but she occasionally caught herself pausing in doorways as if waiting for sounds that would never come. The kitchen felt particularly empty during morning coffee preparation, when muscle memory still prompted her to announce the day's weather to an audience that no longer existed to appreciate such information. She'd kept Jasper's cage for the first 5 years after his disappearance, hope diminishing gradually but never entirely extinguished, like a candle flame that flickers but refuses to die completely. The cage stood in its familiar corner, door open in invitation, water and food dishes refilled daily with the same methodical care she'd maintained during Jasper's presence. Eventually, Rosa had convinced her to donate the cage to the Milwaukee Animal Shelter, approaching the subject with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that letting go required both courage and permission. Senora Margaret, Rosa had said during one of their increasingly infrequent cleaning sessions, her English still heavily accented after 15 years in Milwaukee but clear in its compassionate intention. Keeping his things won't bring him back, but maybe they help another bird be happy, have a good home like Jasper had here. The donation felt like a funeral, a final acknowledgement that Jasper wouldn't return to resume their quiet kitchen mornings and evening conversations. Margaret had insisted on personally delivering the cage to the shelter, where a young volunteer had accepted it with the kind of practiced sympathy that suggested she'd received many similar donations from people whose pets had disappeared into circumstances beyond their control or comprehension. Margaret kept only one item from Jasper's extensive collection of toys, perches, and accessories, a small wooden perch that Robert had carved by hand during Jasper's first year with them, back when Robert's arthritis was manageable and his eyesight still sharp enough for detail work. The perch sat on her nightstand like a secular shrine, a tangible connection to both the husband and the bird, who had filled her life with unexpected moments of joy, conversation, and the particular comfort that comes from sharing daily routines with creatures who understand the value of consistency. Detective Morrison, now retired and living in a small apartment near Veterans Park, occasionally wondered about Margaret's case during quiet evenings, when her mind wandered through the thousands of investigations that had filled her career. She'd followed the leads diligently at the time, interviewed Rosa the cleaning lady, tracked down Jerry the postman, even located and questioned the cable repair technician who'd worked in Margaret's house weeks before Jasper's disappearance. All dead ends, ordinary people living ordinary lives. No obvious connections to missing parrots, or mysterious phrases that suggested domestic violence or criminal activity. The case file remained officially open in the Milwaukee Police Department's database, but practically forgotten, one of hundreds of similar mysteries that police departments accumulate over decades of service. Morrison sometimes considered driving by Margaret's house during her evening walks, checking whether the elderly woman still lived there, whether she'd perhaps acquired another pet to fill the silence that Jasper's departure had created. But she'd never acted on these impulses, understanding that some stories were meant to remain unfinished, their mysteries preserved rather than solved. Margaret's sister Diane continued her annual Christmas visits from Phoenix, bringing the kind of forced cheer that well-meaning relatives offer to those they perceive as lonely, but don't quite know how to help. "You should get another bird," Diane suggested during her 2018 visit, watching Margaret arrange Robert's favorite ornaments on their artificial tree with the careful attention of someone preserving sacred traditions. Or maybe a small dog. Something to keep you company, give you a reason to maintain regular schedules. But Margaret had no interest in replacement companionship. Jasper hadn't been merely a pet, but a bridge between her current solitude and her married life, a living repository of shared memories that died with his disappearance. Another bird would lack the accumulated years of inside jokes, learned behaviors, and unconscious intimacy that made Jasper irreplaceable. It would be like replacing Robert with any random elderly man, theoretically possible, but emotionally meaningless. The neighborhood changed around her with the gradual inevitability of urban evolution. Mrs. Henderson moved to assisted living after her fall during the winter of 2019, her elaborate rose garden gradually succumbing to neglect, despite Margaret's attempts to maintain the prize-winning flowers that had been her neighbor's pride for over 40 years. The Kowalski family sold their house to young professionals who worked from home, their conversations about cryptocurrency and social media marketing as foreign to Margaret as if they spoke another language entirely. New families brought new routines, different sounds drifting through windows during evening hours, children's voices calling to friends, lawnmowers starting earlier on Saturday mornings, music from genres that hadn't existed during Margaret's youth. But none of these sounds included the particular cadences that had once defined her days. Robert's morning cough, Jasper's enthusiastic greetings, the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to coexist without constant conversation. Jerry retired from postal service in 2020, replaced by an efficient young woman who delivered mail without conversation, focusing on speed and accuracy rather than the social interactions that had made Jerry's rounds feel like neighborhood visits. Rosa's arthritis eventually forced her to reduce her client load, and Margaret found herself among the dropped accounts, managing her own cleaning with the methodical attention of someone who had unlimited time and increasingly limited energy. By 2023, Margaret's world had contracted to essential boundaries, monthly grocery shopping trips to the Pick and Save, where she'd shopped for 30 years, quarterly visits to Dr. Rahman for routine medical care, occasional lunch meetings with the 3 remaining friends who hadn't moved away or passed on. She had learned to find contentment in routine, in the predictable rhythms of a life lived quietly but deliberately, without the constant anticipation of change or excitement that had once seemed necessary for happiness. The phone call that shattered this carefully constructed peace came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a voice she didn't recognize but speaking words that transported her instantly back to that October morning 14 years earlier when everything familiar had begun to unravel. "Mrs. Chen? This is Dr. Patricia Williams from the Veterinary Emergency Clinic in Wauwatosa. I'm calling about a parrot that was brought to our facility yesterday. The bird has been repeating your name and phone number, and we have reason to believe he might be the pet you reported missing many years ago." Attorney Lisa Rodriguez had handled her share of unusual cases during her 8 years practicing criminal law in Milwaukee County, but nothing had quite prepared her for the call from the district attorney's office regarding State of Wisconsin versus Marcus Webb. The domestic violence case had initially seemed straightforward, a textbook pattern of escalating abuse documented through hospital records spanning 3 years, neighbor complaints that painted a clear picture of increasing volatility, and the victim's eventual testimony delivered with the hard-won courage of someone who'd finally found strength to speak truth to power. The case might have proceeded through normal channels toward plea negotiations and likely conviction, except for one extraordinary detail that emerged during pretrial investigation when Jennifer Martinez mentioned, almost as an afterthought during their third preparation meeting, that she'd recently reclaimed her childhood pet from circumstances so unusual they bordered on the impossible. The story she told challenged Lisa's understanding of both animal behavior and the persistent nature of memory, suggesting that justice might arrive through the most unlikely messenger imaginable. "I had to give Coco away when Marcus moved in with me," Jennifer explained during their preparation session in the prosecutor's office, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone forced to relive traumatic memories for the benefit of strangers who would judge whether her suffering met legal standards for criminal conviction. "He didn't like animals, said they were dirty and made too much noise, that having a bird in the apartment made him feel like he was living in a zoo. I was young, stupid, thought keeping Marcus happy was more important than keeping my best friend." Lisa set down her pen, recognizing in Jennifer's tone the self-recrimination that domestic violence survivors often carried, the tendency to blame themselves for choices made under circumstances that no healthy relationship should ever create. "When did you give Coco away, and to whom?" Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, as if the story sounded unbelievable even to her, despite having lived through its improbable developments. 2009, right after Marcus and I got serious. My Aunt Margaret took him in. She just lost her husband and thought having a bird might help with the loneliness. Coco lived with her for about a year before he disappeared somehow. I figured he was gone forever, probably died in the cold or got eaten by something. I tried not to think about it because I felt so guilty for giving him away in the first place. The story grew more remarkable as Jennifer continued, her words tumbling together with the urgent pace of someone trying to convince skeptical listeners that impossible events could indeed unfold in the ordinary world. During his 14 years of unexpected freedom, Coco had apparently not only survived Wisconsin's harsh winters, but thrived under the care of Thomas Riley, a Vietnam veteran who'd been living rough in various Milwaukee area parks since the early 2000s, existing on disability payments and the kindness of strangers who understood that some wounds took decades to heal. Riley was found unconscious in Oak Creek Park by a jogger who called 911, Jennifer explained, consulting notes she'd taken during her phone conversations with veterinary staff who'd treated both man and bird. He was having some kind of medical emergency, but he kept talking about his bird, begging the paramedics to take care of Coco. They thought he was delirious until they found this gray parrot sitting right next to him, like he was standing guard or something. Lisa made notes while trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. Riley had constructed elaborate shelters, designed to accommodate both his needs and those of his unusual companion, moving seasonally between different parks to avoid harsh weather and the park authorities who might separate them. The arrangements apparently worked well enough that both man and bird had survived over a decade of outdoor living, creating their own version of family among the urban forests and hidden spaces that most people never noticed. Riley passed away at the emergency vet clinic while they were examining Coco, Jennifer continued, her voice softening with genuine sadness for a man she'd never met but whose kindness had preserved something precious that she'd thought lost forever. But before he died, he kept repeating my name and phone number, over and over, until Coco learned them perfectly. That's how the veterinarian found me. Coco started saying, "Call Jennifer Martinez," and then reciting my number like he was reading from a phone book. The reunion between Jennifer and her childhood pet might have represented nothing more than a remarkable tale of survival and determination, except for one detail that transformed their touching story into potential evidence for criminal prosecution. During his years with Marcus Webb, Coco had apparently absorbed more than anyone realized, storing conversations and experiences in the remarkable memory that made African gray parrots such devoted but sometimes inconvenient companions. "The thing is," Jennifer said, her voice dropping to near whisper as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the impossible situation disappear, "Coco remembers things from before he went to live with Aunt Margaret. From when I lived with Marcus. He keeps repeating things Marcus used to say to me, threats he made, horrible things I thought I'd forgotten or convinced myself weren't as bad as they seemed at the time." The room fell silent as the implications settled over both women like a heavy blanket that changed the temperature and atmosphere of everything it touched. Lisa had heard of cases where pets witnessed domestic violence, their behavior serving as silent testimony to household dynamics that victims were too frightened or traumatized to report. But she'd never encountered a situation where the animal could potentially testify to what it had observed, where memory might serve as evidence in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about witness testimony and admissible evidence. "What exactly does Coco say?" Lisa asked, though she suspected the answer would complicate their straightforward domestic violence case in ways that would challenge legal precedent and force her to research areas of law that most attorneys never had reason to explore. Jennifer closed her eyes as if summoning courage to repeat words she'd hoped never to hear again, phrases that carried the weight of experiences she'd spent years trying to forget or minimize. "Please don't hurt me anymore. Stop, Marcus, you're scaring me. I'm sorry, please don't hit me." And then he says other things, specific threats about what Marcus would do if I ever left him or called the police, details about incidents I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined. Lisa stared at her legal pad, mind racing through questions of precedent, admissibility rules, and the surreal possibility that a missing parrot might hold the key to securing a conviction that would otherwise depend entirely on Jennifer's testimony, against a man who'd spent 3 years systematically undermining her credibility, her confidence, and her belief that anyone would ever believe her word against his carefully maintained public persona. The ethical implications were staggering, but so was the potential for justice that had been 14 years in the making, carried in the memory of a bird who'd spent over a decade in the wilderness, preserving evidence of crimes that might otherwise remain forever unpunished because their only witness had been taught that her voice didn't matter, her experiences didn't count, her memory couldn't be trusted. Lisa found herself facing questions that law school had never addressed. Could a parrot's vocalizations constitute admissible evidence? Did the bird's remarkable memory for traumatic events carry more weight than human testimony that might be clouded by fear, time, or the psychological defense mechanisms that help survivors cope with unbearable experiences? And perhaps most importantly, would a jury be willing to convict a man based partly on testimony delivered by a creature that had no understanding of truth, lies, or the consequences of the words it repeated with mechanical precision? As Jennifer continued describing Coco's disturbing repertoire of remembered phrases, Lisa realized they were venturing into uncharted legal territory that would require unprecedented research, expert witnesses, and a level of courtroom creativity that most criminal cases never demanded. The potential for both spectacular success and humiliating failure seemed equally likely, but the opportunity to deliver justice through such extraordinary means felt too significant to ignore. "Jennifer," Lisa said carefully, "I need you to understand that what you're describing could change everything about how we approach this case. But it's also going to make everything much more complicated, much more public, and much more difficult to predict. Are you prepared for that kind of attention, that kind of scrutiny?" Jennifer nodded with the determination of someone who'd already survived the worst that could happen and emerged ready to fight for something better. "I've been silent for too long, Lisa. If Coco can speak the truth I was too scared to tell, then maybe there's a reason he came back to me now, after all these years. Maybe this is how justice is supposed to work." The Milwaukee County Courthouse had witnessed its share of unusual evidence presentations during its century-long history of dispensing justice, but nothing quite prepared the legal community for the scene unfolding in Judge Patricia Hoffman's courtroom on that humid June morning when the state of Wisconsin formally introduced its most unconventional witness. Court reporters adjusted their equipment to capture not just human testimony, but the distinctive voice of Coco, an African gray parrot perched in a specially constructed enclosure near the witness stand, his dark, intelligent eyes surveying the assembled crowd, with the calm attention of someone accustomed to being the center of unusual circumstances. Lisa Rodriguez had spent the previous 6 months researching precedent for animal testimony, consulting with experts in animal behavior, criminal law, and constitutional scholars who'd never imagined they might need to address the Sixth Amendment implications of cross-examining a bird. The legal community had watched with fascination and skepticism as the case pushed boundaries of evidence admissibility that had stood unchallenged for centuries, forcing judges and attorneys to confront questions that exposed fundamental assumptions about consciousness, memory, and the nature of reliable testimony. Defense attorney Michael Chang objected predictably and repeatedly, his voice carrying the frustrated edge of someone arguing against developments that defied traditional legal reasoning. Your Honor, the defense strenuously objects to this entire proceeding. We have no opportunity to cross-examine this alleged witness, cannot establish the reliability of statements made by an animal who lacks understanding of truth, consequences, or the oath required for testimony. This bird doesn't understand the difference between fact and fiction, cannot distinguish between original memories and subsequently learned phrases, and has no comprehension of the gravity of criminal proceedings or the impact of its vocalizations on human lives. Judge Hoffman, known throughout the Wisconsin legal community for her meticulous attention to precedent and measured consideration of novel legal questions, had spent weeks reviewing case law from multiple jurisdictions, consulting with colleagues across the country, and wrestling with questions that challenged her understanding of evidence, witness testimony, and the fundamental principles that govern criminal trial. Mr. Chang, your objections are noted and thoroughly understood by this court. However, the prosecution isn't presenting the parrot as a traditional witness, but as a repository of statements made by the defendant in the presence of the victim. The bird's vocalizations constitute hearsay evidence under the spontaneous utterance exception, similar to how we might admit recordings or written statements that capture contemporaneous expressions of fear or distress. Jennifer Martinez sat in the gallery, surrounded by victim advocates and family members who'd made the journey from Phoenix to support her through what promised to be the most difficult and public experience of her adult life. Her hands trembled as she recognized phrases emerging from Coco's beak that she'd hoped never to hear again, each familiar word transporting her back to the cramped apartment where Marcus Webb had systematically isolated her from friends and family, controlling her movements, her contacts, her very sense of what constituted normal behavior in intimate relationships. "Please don't hurt me anymore," Coco repeated in Jennifer's exact voice, capturing not just her words but the pleading tone, the desperate cadence of someone begging for mercy from a person who demonstrated repeatedly that mercy was a luxury he rarely provided. The phrase emerged with the mechanical precision that characterized all of Coco's vocalizations, yet somehow retained the emotional undertone that had originally given those words their devastating power. The prosecution played audio recordings of Webb's voice for comparison, establishing that Coco could accurately mimic both participants in the domestic disputes he'd witnessed during his months in Jennifer's apartment. The bird demonstrated this ability by repeating Webb's threats in the defendant's distinctive bass tone, complete with the slight Texas accent that made his words even more menacing when delivered through Coco's mechanically perfect reproduction. "I'll kill you if you try to leave me," came from Coco's throat in Webb's voice, followed immediately by Jennifer's terrified response, I'm sorry, please don't hit me." The juxtaposition of threat and plea, delivered with inhuman precision but undeniable emotional authenticity, created a courtroom atmosphere that felt simultaneously surreal and deeply disturbing. Webb shifted uncomfortably at the defense table, his carefully maintained composure cracking slightly as he heard his own words delivered by a creature whose existence he'd probably forgotten, whose presence in Jennifer's life he'd dismissed as unimportant enough to warrant only banishment rather than destruction. His attorney frantically scribbled notes while objecting to each new revelation, but the evidence created an impossible situation. How do you impeach a witness who merely repeats conversations without interpretation or bias, whose memory spans 14 years without degradation or selective editing? Dr. Emily Patterson, an animal behavior expert from the University of Wisconsin's Veterinary School, explained to the jury how African gray parrots process and store vocal information with remarkable accuracy and longevity. "These birds don't simply mimic sounds randomly," she testified, her academic credentials lending weight to explanations that might otherwise seem too extraordinary for legal proceedings. "They associate specific phrases with emotional context, learning and retaining words that carry high emotional intensity. Coco would have learned these particular phrases because they were repeated frequently and delivered with the kind of emotional charge that makes certain experiences unforgettable. The defense called their own expert, Dr. Robert Kim from Northwestern University, who emphasized the limitations of animal memory and the impossibility of establishing when Coco learned specific phrases, or from whom he might have acquired the disturbing vocabulary that formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. This bird spent 14 years in various environments, exposed to countless human voices and conversations. There's no way to prove these statements originated from interactions with my client, rather than television programs, other people, or even his own imagination. Parrots are notorious for combining phrases in novel ways that create new meanings their original speakers never intended. But Lisa Rodriguez had anticipated this challenge and spent months building a comprehensive case that addressed every possible alternative explanation for Coco's testimony. She presented veterinary records showing that Coco had been examined immediately after his recovery from Thomas Riley's care, with no evidence of recent trauma or exposure to domestic violence situations during his years in the park. Riley's military records painted a picture of a gentleman whose post-traumatic stress led him to seek solitude rather than conflict, someone more likely to protect a vulnerable creature than expose it to additional violence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Rodriguez said during her opening statement, "We're not asking you to convict based solely on a bird's testimony. We're asking you to consider evidence that has been preserved in the most unlikely way imaginable by a creature who witnessed horrors no living being should endure, carried those memories through 14 years of separation and survival, and delivered them back to us when justice finally had the chance to prevail." The testimony continued for 3 days, with Coco repeating phrases that painted a comprehensive picture of the relationship between Jennifer and Marcus Webb. Some vocalizations were simple expressions of fear, "Stop, you're hurting me," and "Please don't do this." Others revealed the systematic nature of Webb's control. "You can't leave, nobody else would want you, and if you call the police, I'll make sure you regret it forever." Perhaps most damaging were the phrases that revealed Webb's awareness of his own behavior and his deliberate choice to continue despite Jennifer's obvious distress. Coco repeated in Webb's voice, "Nobody will believe you anyway," and "You made me do this by not listening the first time." These statements suggested not crimes of passion but calculated abuse designed to maintain control through fear and intimidation. The defense's cross-examination strategy focused on the impossibility of establishing chain of custody for memories that had traveled through time and circumstance in ways that defied legal precedent. Chang argued that 14 years of separation made any testimony unreliable, that exposure to unknown influences during Coco's time in the wilderness could have corrupted his memory or introduced new phrases that had nothing to do with his original experiences with Jennifer and Webb. "Your Honor," Chang argued during one particularly heated exchange, "we're being asked to convict a man based on evidence that cannot be verified, cross-examined, or subjected to the normal standards of reliability that govern criminal proceedings. This bird is not a tape recorder that faithfully preserves conversations exactly as they occurred. It's a living creature whose memory has been influenced by countless variables that we cannot control, measure, or even identify." But as the trial progressed, even skeptical observers began to recognize patterns in Coco's testimony that suggested something more than random phrase combination or contaminated memory. The bird's vocalizations formed coherent conversations, with Jennifer's pleas for mercy followed logically by Webb's threats or demands. The emotional progression of these exchanges told a story that felt authentic in ways that fictional reconstructions rarely achieved. Dr. Patterson returned to the stand to explain how traumatic memories often became more deeply embedded than routine experiences, creating what she termed emotional scarring that could preserve specific details with remarkable accuracy. "Coco would have been terrified during these incidents," she explained. "That fear would have made the associated words and voices unforgettable in ways that casual conversation never could." Judge Hoffman faced the unprecedented task of instructing a jury on how to evaluate evidence that challenged traditional concepts of witness reliability and testimony admissibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," she told the 12 citizens charged with determining Webb's fate, "you must decide whether this evidence meets the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. Consider not just what you've heard, but the circumstances under which these memories were preserved and the likelihood that they represent accurate recollections of actual events." As closing arguments approached, both legal teams understood they were participating in a trial that would likely influence how animal testimony might be considered in future cases, setting precedents that could expand or restrict the definition of admissible evidence in ways that neither side could fully predict or control. Margaret Chen sat in the courthouse gallery during the third day of testimony, studying the bird she'd known as Jasper for 12 years, now revealed as Coco, Jennifer Martinez's childhood companion whose disappearance had left a permanent hollow space in her carefully ordered life. The recognition was unmistakable despite the years that had passed. The distinctive pattern of gray feathers on his neck that resembled a natural collar, the way he tilted his head when listening intently, as if filtering sound through some internal mechanism that determined which words deserved attention, even the precise manner in which he cleaned his claws, using his beak, with the methodical attention of someone performing a sacred ritual. Yet this was also clearly a different bird than the one who'd shared her kitchen mornings and evening conversations, shaped by 14 years of experiences she could barely imagine, but whose effects were visible in his bearing and behavior. Coco moved with the confident grace of a creature who'd learned to navigate an unpredictable world, who developed survival skills that domesticated animals rarely needed to acquire. His eyes held a wariness that hadn't existed during his time in her quiet home, the alertness of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and comfort could disappear without warning. During the lunch recess, Jennifer approached Margaret with the tentative manner of someone unsure of their reception, her footsteps careful and measured, as if she were approaching something fragile that might break under too much pressure. The young woman's face showed the strain of 3 days spent listening to her own traumatic experiences, recounted through the mechanically precise voice of a bird who'd preserved her worst memories with inhuman accuracy. "Mrs. Chen?" Jennifer's voice carried the particular quality of someone trying to express gratitude for kindness they couldn't adequately repay. "I wanted to thank you for taking care of Coco all those years, for giving him a home when I was too young and too scared to protect him myself. I never knew what happened to him after my aunt said he'd disappeared. I assumed the worst, figured he'd died in the cold or been killed by something, and I felt so guilty for giving him away in the first place." The conversation that followed pieced together a story that neither woman had fully understood until this moment, revealing connections and circumstances that transformed what had seemed like random misfortune into something approaching destiny. Jennifer had been 18 when she'd made the heartbreaking decision to give Coco to her Aunt Margaret, scared and naive about the man she'd begun dating, willing to sacrifice her beloved pet to avoid Marcus Webb's increasingly frequent expressions of anger and displeasure about sharing his living space with a noisy, dirty bird that served no useful purpose. Margaret listened with the growing understanding that Jasper's unusual final words, "Please don't hurt me anymore," had been neither random television absorption nor signs of distress within her own household, but rather echoes from a previous life. The bird she'd known as a gentle, talkative companion had actually been carrying the traumatic memories of someone else's suffering, preserving evidence of crimes he'd witnessed before finding sanctuary in her quiet kitchen. "He was happy with you," Jennifer said, tears gathering as she watched Coco preen his feathers in the courtroom enclosure with the calm attention of someone accustomed to being observed by strangers who didn't quite know what to make of his unusual situation. "I can tell from how healthy he looks, how calm he seems, even in all this chaos. You gave him something I couldn't back then. Safety, routine, a place where nobody was angry all the time." Margaret felt pieces of an old puzzle finally clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a mechanism that had been waiting years for its component parts to align properly. Jasper's strange behavior that final morning in 2009, his repetition of words that had no context in their peaceful household, his apparent need to escape through an impossible route, all of it made sense now. He hadn't been fleeing from her care, but perhaps towards something else. Some instinct that drew him back toward the person who'd originally needed his protection and witness. The idea that an animal might possess such purpose, such determination to fulfill what could only be described as a mission, challenged Margaret's understanding of consciousness and intention in ways that felt both unsettling and profoundly moving. She'd spent 12 years providing Jasper with comfort and security, never realizing that she was actually caring for a refugee whose memories contained evidence that would eventually serve justice in ways that human testimony alone might never achieve. "That homeless veteran who found him," Margaret said, "Thomas Riley, do you know anything more about him? About how they survived together all those years?" Jennifer nodded, consulting notes she'd taken during extensive conversations with veterinary staff who treated both man and bird during Riley's final days. Thomas Riley served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home with PTSD that made it hard for him to live around other people for extended periods. He'd been existing in parks around Milwaukee for years, but according to the VA social worker who'd tried to help him, he wasn't dangerous or unstable. More like he couldn't handle being around too many people at once, needed space and quiet that regular housing couldn't provide. The image that emerged was of a man who'd found in Coco a companion as displaced as himself, both creatures living on society's margins by choice and circumstance, creating their own version of family among the urban forests and hidden spaces that most people never noticed or acknowledged. Riley had apparently taught Coco practical survival skills, how to forage for safe foods in park environments, recognize dangerous weather patterns that required shelter, identify trustworthy humans who might offer temporary assistance without expecting anything in return. Mr. Riley kept a journal, Jennifer continued, her voice softening with genuine sadness for a man she'd never met but whose kindness had preserved something precious that she'd thought lost forever. The hospital found it among his belongings when he died. He wrote about Coco almost every day, called him his wingman, said the bird reminded him that some things in the world were still worth protecting, even when everything else seemed determined to fall apart or destroy itself. Margaret absorbed this information with the complex mixture of grief and gratitude that comes from learning that something precious you'd lost had somehow found its way to exactly where it needed to be, guided by forces that operated beyond human understanding or control. Jasper's disappearance hadn't been abandonment or tragedy, but perhaps the most purposeful decision of his life, guided by instincts that understood Jennifer's need in ways that human logic never could have calculated or predicted. The journal entries that Jennifer described painted a picture of unexpected friendship between species, two survivors who'd found in each other the kind of loyalty and understanding that transcended conventional definitions of family or companionship. Riley had written about Coco's remarkable intelligence, his ability to learn new survival skills, his seemingly intuitive understanding of when to remain hidden, and when it was safe to interact with the occasional park visitors who crossed their path. One entry said that Coco sometimes talked in his sleep, Jennifer explained, repeating phrases that didn't match anything from their life in the park. Mr. Riley thought the bird was remembering dreams or maybe conversations from before they found each other. He had no way of knowing that Coco was actually preserving evidence of crimes, keeping those memories alive until they could serve their original purpose. As the afternoon session resumed, Margaret watched the defense attorney's continued attempts to discredit Coco's memory, arguing that 14 years in the wilderness had necessarily compromised the bird's ability to distinguish between original experiences and subsequently learned phrases. But Margaret knew better. Armed with 12 years of careful observation of Jasper's selective learning patterns, his tendency to absorb and repeat only those words that carried significant emotional weight or represented frequently repeated interactions. The phrases Coco was repeating in court weren't random memorizations, but careful preservation of moments when Jennifer had needed witness to her suffering, when Marcus Webb had assumed his threats and violence would remain forever unheard and unremembered by anyone capable of reporting his behavior to authorities. Margaret realized she'd been caring not just for a pet, but for a living archive of injustice, a creature carrying evidence of crimes that might otherwise never face accountability in any court of law. When court adjourned for the day, Margaret approached the prosecution table where Lisa Rodriguez was organizing files and preparing for what promised to be an intensive evening of preparation for closing arguments. "Ms. Rodriguez," Margaret said, her voice carrying the certainty that comes from years of intimate observation and understanding, "I want you to know that Bird has an extraordinary memory for emotional truth. If he's repeating those words, it's because they mattered deeply to someone he cared about. Don't let them convince you that his memory is unreliable or corrupted by time. Some experiences are too important to forget, even for a bird." The attorney looked up, recognizing in Margaret's voice the authority that comes from years of patient observation and the kind of deep knowledge that can only be acquired through daily interaction and genuine affection. "Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to testify about Coco's character and learning patterns? Your experience with him might help the jury understand how reliable his memory actually is, how selective parrots are about which phrases they choose to preserve and repeat." Margaret nodded without hesitation, understanding that her role in this extraordinary story wasn't ending with Jasper's return but expanding to include whatever testimony might help deliver the justice that had been 14 years in the making, carried through wilderness and hardship by a bird whose loyalty transcended the boundaries between species and whose memory had become an instrument of truth that no human witness could have provided with equal. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 43 minutes, a period during which Margaret Chen found herself in the unusual position of hoping her former pet's traumatic memories would be believed by 12 strangers who'd never experienced the uncanny intelligence of an African gray parrot, or witnessed the remarkable accuracy with which these birds could preserve and reproduce human conversations across spans of time that exceeded many people's ability to remember their own experiences. She sat with Jennifer Martinez in the courthouse cafe, two women brought together by a bird whose extraordinary journey had connected their separate losses into a single story of resilience, survival, and unexpected justice, delivered through the most unlikely messenger imaginable. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while they waited, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the surreal nature of their situation. Around them, other families waited for verdicts in their own cases. Drunk driving charges, property disputes, custody battles, all the ordinary tragedies and conflicts that filled courthouse calendars with depressing regularity. But none of those cases involved testimony from a creature who'd spent 14 years in the wilderness, preserving evidence of crimes that had occurred when most of the current jurors were still in high school. "I never thought I'd see Coco again," Jennifer said, stirring her coffee without drinking it, her movements mechanical and distracted as her mind processed 3 days of listening to her own traumatic experiences, recounted through the voice of a bird who'd preserved her worst memories with inhuman accuracy. "And I certainly never imagined he'd be the one to help me finally stand up to Marcus, to prove that all those things really happened the way I remembered them. It feels like something impossible, like the kind of story people tell but never actually experience." Margaret smiled at the wonder in Jennifer's voice, remembering her own amazement during the early days of caring for Jasper, when his intelligence and emotional sensitivity had exceeded every expectation she'd held about animal consciousness and capability. Robert always said Jasper was more than just a pet, that he was like a living recorder of everything important that happened in our house. I just never realized he'd been recording important things before he came to us, carrying someone else's story that would eventually need to be told. The conversation drifted through the afternoon as they waited, covering topics that neither woman would have imagined discussing with a stranger just days earlier. Jennifer spoke about her years of self-doubt, the way Marcus Webb had systematically undermined her confidence, until she'd begun to question her own memories and perceptions. Margaret described the quiet loneliness that had settled over her life after losing both Robert and Jasper, the way silence could become both comfort and burden depending on the circumstances that created it. When a bailiff finally appeared to announce that the jury had reached a verdict, both women felt their hearts accelerate with the particular anxiety that accompanies moments when everything important hangs in the balance, when years of hoping and struggling culminate in decisions made by strangers who will never fully understand the human cost of their deliberations. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread that Milwaukee County's most unusual trial was nearing its conclusion. Local news crews had followed the case with fascination, recognizing that the precedent being set would likely influence legal proceedings across the country and possibly around the world. Legal scholars had traveled from universities and law firms to observe how Judge Hoffman would handle the unprecedented questions of animal testimony and evidence admissibility that the case had raised. Coco sat quietly in his enclosure, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment, or simply content to observe the humans who'd spent days discussing his memories as if they held the weight of justice itself. His calm demeanor provided stark contrast to the tension that filled every other corner of the courtroom, where lawyers checked their notes one final time, and family members held hands or whispered prayers to whatever deities they believed might influence the outcome of human justice. When the jury returned, their faces revealed nothing of their deliberations or the conversations that had led them to their unanimous decision. Judge Hoffman called the court to order with the formal authority that had characterized her handling of this unprecedented case, her voice steady, despite the knowledge that her rulings would likely be cited in legal textbooks and appellate decisions for years to come. The foreman stood with the careful dignity of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment, holding a piece of paper that contained the culmination of 14 years of waiting, 3 days of testimony, and hours of deliberation about whether justice could be delivered through the preserved memories of a creature whose only crime had been witnessing horrors that no living being should endure. On the charge of domestic violence in the first degree, the foreman announced, his voice cutting through the courtroom tension like a blade through silk, decisive and clean despite the complexity of the case that had brought them to this moment. "We find the defendant guilty." Jennifer's sob of relief echoed through the gallery, 14 years of fear and self-doubt finally validated by a legal system that had seemed unreachable when she'd needed it most, when she'd been too young and frightened to believe that anyone would take her word against Marcus Webb's carefully maintained public persona. Margaret felt her own tears come, not just for Jennifer's vindication, but for the extraordinary journey that had brought Jasper, Coco, full circle, from witness to survivor to the instrument of justice that human testimony alone might never have achieved. On the charges of criminal intimidation and terroristic threatening, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Marcus Webb sat stone-faced as Judge Hoffman scheduled sentencing for the following month, his attorney already preparing appeals that would likely focus on the unprecedented nature of animal testimony and the constitutional questions that the case had raised about confrontation rights and witness reliability. But the jury had spoken with unanimous conviction, and their verdict suggested that truth could emerge from the most unlikely sources when given the opportunity to be heard and evaluated by people willing to expand their understanding of consciousness, memory, and justice. After the court cleared and the media interviews concluded, Margaret approached Coco's enclosure with the careful movements of someone greeting an old friend after a long separation filled with uncertainty and loss. The bird studied her with the tilted head attention she remembered from their 12 years together, then spoke in Robert's voice with perfect clarity. "Another beautiful day, Maggie." The phrase hit her like unexpected sunlight, carrying with it the weight of mornings shared, companionship treasured, and love that persists beyond physical presence or the limitations of individual mortality. But there was something different in how Coco delivered the words now. Less mechanical mimicry than genuine sentiment, as if 14 years of living had taught him the deeper meaning behind the sounds he'd so carefully preserved and protected through circumstances that should have destroyed such delicate memories. "He's different now," Jennifer observed, watching the interaction between Margaret and the bird they'd both loved in different ways and different circumstances. Stronger somehow, more confident, like those years in the park, taught him things he needed to know about survival and purpose that domestic life never could have provided. Margaret nodded, recognizing in Coco's bearing the quiet confidence that comes from surviving challenges that might have destroyed someone less resilient or determined. The bird who'd disappeared from her kitchen window had returned as a creature capable of standing witness to injustice, of carrying memories across years and circumstances until they could finally serve their intended purpose in ways that defied conventional understanding of animal consciousness and capability. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Jennifer made an offer that surprised them both with its generosity and wisdom. "Mrs. Chen, I know Coco was yours for 12 years, and you gave him a life filled with love and security when I was too young to protect him properly. If you'd like him to come back and live with you, I'd understand completely. You've earned that right through years of patience and care." Margaret considered the offer seriously, feeling the pull of familiar companionship, the promise of mornings brightened by Robert's remembered voice, and the comfortable rhythms that she and Jasper had established during their years together. But she also saw the way Coco watched Jennifer, the subtle signs of recognition and protective attention that spoke to bonds forged in childhood and strengthened by shared experiences of survival against impossible odds. "He belongs with you," Margaret said finally, her voice carrying the certainty that comes from understanding that love sometimes means letting go, even when holding on would bring personal comfort and joy. "He always did. I just kept him safe until he could find his way home and complete the mission he'd been carrying all these years without anyone understanding its importance." The three of them walked out of the courthouse together. Two women whose lives had intersected through circumstances neither could have predicted, and a bird whose extraordinary memory had transformed private suffering into public justice, whose 14-year journey through wilderness and hardship had culminated in a moment of truth that vindicated not just Jennifer's experiences, but the broader principle that justice could emerge from the most unexpected sources when preservation. Behind them, the legal system continued its ancient work of seeking truth through testimony, evidence, and the faith that somewhere in every story lies a version of events worth preserving, worth believing, worth acting upon, with the full weight of societal authority and moral conviction. The precedent they'd helped establish would influence cases for years to come, expanding the definition of witness testimony and evidence reliability in ways that acknowledge the complexity of consciousness and memory across species boundaries. If stories like Jennifer's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Sometimes justice arrives through the most unexpected messengers, carried by those we least expect to serve as vessels of truth, preserved by loyalty that transcends the boundaries between species and the limitations of individual understanding. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart, reminding us that courage and memory can triumph over time, distance, and the forces that seek to silence truth.